Today, we're lucky enough to have one of my young colleagues, Dr. Margaret Jodlowski, who's going to talk about, as far as she's able to, in the sense that the debt ceiling issue hasn't been resolved yet. Maybe might get closer to resolution today, but that is holding up discussions on the Farm Bill necessarily. So Margaret has been spending quite a bit of time getting up to speed on the Farm Bill and Farm Bill negotiations. So we look forward to hearing her comments, and I look forward to getting your questions at the end of the session today. So Margaret, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. It's, as Ian said, an exciting time to talk about the Farm Bill, but also it feels maybe a little bit moot, given how negotiations could go today with the debt ceiling. It remains unclear whether or not this will have any relevance whatsoever, but I do appreciate you all being here. And I'd also like, before we jump in, just to get some technicalities out of the way. So the debt ceiling one is of course first, and note that I say a debt ceiling deal passes, so that's not the debt ceiling deal, and not necessarily the one being voted on today. That would be obviously the most expedient outcome, but of course any debt ceiling deal will move things forward for the Farm Bill, but no debt ceiling deal will really really change the tenor of these Farm Bill negotiations in a pretty dramatic way. And given that this is an outlook, and given all the uncertainty with the debt ceiling, this is, it is an outlook talk, and as with most outlook talks, but perhaps more than other outlook talks, this is going to be a somewhat murky conversation always, because it's more than economics that's involved. It's more than just the numbers on the page. There's personalities, there's coalitions, there's debates and conversations, and all of that is very hard to predict. All of us who work with people know that people are often the root and solution to many of the problems that we would face in this kind of negotiation. On the subject of conversation, Ian very kindly referred to me as one of his younger colleagues. This is true. And I would really like today to be something of a conversation. This is my first Farm Bill as a faculty member, so this is something that is, I've obviously been paying attention to Farm Bill negotiations while I was a student, but this is my first one really as an expert. And my area, of course, being labor, my primary interest being labor. This is not, labor doesn't feature very heavily in the Farm Bill as well. So I would really appreciate the opportunity to learn from those of you who have significantly more than one, or even just more than one, experience with Farm Bill negotiations in the past. So when we have that Q&A, I'd like for that to be a healthy discussion. And as we move into this sort of discussion of the Farm Bill, a bigger question that's come up as I've had conversations with people, sort of around the country, and that question is the relevance of the Farm Bill going down, given that the way that farm payments, government payments happened during the disruptions of the last 5 years since the 2018 Farm Bill? Is the relevance of the Farm Bill going down in light of these ad hoc executive action style payments? Is the Farm Bill going to continue to be it will probably continue to be the most relevant piece of farm legislation, but is its importance going to be shrinking? And are we seeing ag policy now coming in different spaces? Of course, as we start to tackle all of the different externalities related to agriculture and try and grapple with some of the things that involve major constraints on agricultural production, like labor, that aren't included in the Farm Bill, there is this sense that we are changing the way that agricultural policy is being done. And so that is something that is also interesting to keep in mind as we move forward through our discussion. And the last sort of little caveat here on my slide of caveats, always a great way to start a talk, is that this is just a very small snapshot of the topics that could be covered. Everyone, and this is what I think makes the Farm Bill so exciting and so interesting, everyone has their own piece of the pie that they think is the most important and the most interesting. But of course, this is only a small snapshot of what we could talk about today. And in terms of what we are going to talk about today, I'm just going to check the chat real quick in case this is a technical problem. Oh, it's just Miles saying use the Q&A. That's great. In terms of what we're going to do, the first and most important is going to be an update on the Farm Bill, where negotiations currently are in light of the baseline projections that were put out earlier this month, looking at the different programs and the different allocations. And then if, of course, we're always still going to remember the caveats, but then if there's time, I'd also like to have a little bit more of a broader discussion about longer term trends in agricultural policy. And the things that I've identified as what may be increasingly relevant as we go forward into this brave new world of the post-COVID Farm Bill. The first is this idea of the farm safety net expanding. Is the farm safety net deepening? So is it having greater depth? And is it also broadening? Is it covering more areas of risk? Is the farm safety net in the future going to protect against different sources of uncertainty that maybe hadn't been in the past? And so that is one of the, I think, probably the most important thing, and I hinted at it earlier as well, which may or may not impact the importance and the relevance of the Farm Bill going forward. And so this is my sort of ag policy beyond the legislature, let alone beyond the Farm Bill, but maybe even beyond legislature at all. And the other trend is this, I could either say sustainability goes corporate or sustainability goes mainstream. So this idea, we've heard a lot of conversation, I think, since the last Farm Bill now about different, major corporate entities looking at these options for sustainability across their supply chain, and whatever that may mean, and whether or not it's just all talk or greenwashing, it is impacting the way that they are doing business and impacting a lot of really important decisions, even at the farm level, when you think about carbon credits and things like that. So there's this really important feature here of mainstream or corporate sustainability that has pushed the conversation in a really beyond where we would have predicted. And then last, I just finished teaching for the semester, so AI is of course right on the top of my head with my students and the tools that they have at their disposal. But the role of technology and AI, I think it needs to be discussed, and I think it needs to be given some more attention in the policy space. And so we'll have a little bit of a conversation about that at the end, again, if we have time. And then, of course, I am going to leave some time for questions, and feel free to leave those in the chat in the Q&A function throughout. And if there's, again, like to have a dialogue here and like to have, a healthy conversation around these topics. So without further ado, the Farm Bill update. I went back and forth on the title here. I said, what is on the table? I could have also written, will there be a table? Are we still talking about tables at all? Is the table being blown to smithereens? Will we be able to afford a table? All of these are somewhat tongue-in-cheek references to our, of course, potential impending debt ceiling crisis. But I stuck with the nice middle of the road. What is on the table in 2023? And so the easiest way to show that is, of course, just to show the projected baseline allocations. This is a lovely graphic courtesy of the Senate Ag GOP analysis, and shows first and most importantly this headline number right here. This, of course, is a sort of landmark Farm Bill for a couple of reasons. I think it's the first in this sort of brave new world, post unprecedented times, post COVID Farm Bill, and it is also the first to crack that $1 trillion mark. So the total allocation allocated for in the May 2023 Congressional Budget Office baseline is $1.5 trillion. Now, this is an update or revision from the February 2023 estimates, and in that case, we were below that $1 trillion mark. What pushed us over is, of course, increases to SNAP. So SNAP funding is now sitting at $1.2 trillion. And this is, of course, as everyone can see, and I think it's pretty well known, the majority of Farm Bill funding is, of course, going to SNAP. And so when we think about how this money is allocated, and especially when we think about increases from the original February February 2023 baseline to now, SNAP increased the most in dollar terms, but there were also really important increases in the more farm-centric titles and programs as well. And so the percent increase for our commodity programs, for our Title I programs, as well as for crop insurance, increased percentage-wise much more than the SNAP increase. But of course, the SNAP increase, having that big headline number, is getting a lot of attention, but the proportional increase for our farm-related programs is actually much more. And that's good news. And that is primarily being driven by revisions to the forecasted commodity prices as we look into the next decade, forecasting lower prices across different commodities, but particularly in things like dairy and upland cotton. Not so relevant for our Ohio people on the call, but those two especially seeing low prices, as well as low prices across our feed and oil grains as well. And so that is where we're sitting right now at 1.5 trillion. As usual, majority of that is going to SNAP, but also seeing really important increases and sizable percent increases, even though the dollar values aren't as high, sizable percent increases for both crop insurance and our commodity related programs. Those, of course, being the fundamental components of the farm safety net. Another interesting piece of the pie that we haven't seen in past years is this Inflation Reduction Act funding. So this funding is sitting in a sort of interesting place, and it will be, I think, an important place where there's going to be a lot of tension and negotiation around how this funding is allocated, whether or not it is repealed and then absorbed into Farm Bill spending as a protected baseline or a protected program, and how then it is allocated once it's part of Farm Bill funding. This is going to be, I think, even though it's, when you look at the slice of the pie that it's making up, it's a small piece of the pie, but I think it could be, for political and reasons of political economy, it could be an important area for debate, given the tension around the passage of that act to begin with. I think that this is going to be a place where there is going to be a lot of discussion. And for those of us who want to see a Farm Bill pass, we hope that discussion is productive, but of course that always remains to be seen. So if we pull up our February versus May baseline projections, it's going to be a slightly different graphic with slightly different colors. Of course, nothing can be standard or easy. We see that increase in SNAP of $18 billion. Obviously, that's a very large number and did get a lot of attention. Pushes SNAP to just above 80% of the funding of the baseline projection. Oh, excuse me. But we also, as I mentioned, we see these really important increases in both our commodity titles, so our Title I programs, increased by less in terms of dollar value, from 57 billion to 68 billion. But of course, that proportionally, that increase is a much more sizable percent than this 18 billion out of this total of 1.2 trillion. And so we see really important increases across all of these, again, reflecting lower future commodity prices, as well as some increased projected use of SNAP as unemployment continues to fluctuate and job transitions continue to be very noticeable, and the market continues to have a little bit of disruption. The increase in SNAP is reflecting the predicted increased need for supplemental food purchasing ability. It's also reflecting something of what we've all, I think, recognized, and that is the increase in grocery prices sort of across the board. We've seen higher food prices at the grocery stores, and so the SNAP dollars are not going as far, and so this projection was revised upwards to sort of reflect that as well. So I like when we dial in on the different Farm Bill titles and programs, when we look at the ag specific ones, so if we remove that big piece of the pie and move away from SNAP, I like to think of them as in two different ways. So we have the safety net, and then the 1%, or even if you're being super accurate, the less than 1%. And so in the safety net, of course, we have these sort of fundamental, crucial pieces of the Farm Bill, which are designed to support the farmers of America and provide some sort of stability in terms of income over time. Of course, these have their roots in the early part of the last century when we were experiencing a Great Depression. And of course, then the government's focus was mostly on supply management. We had the sort of breakthrough change in the way that the government supported farmers in 1996 with Freedom to Farm. And then as we've moved from 1996, which is almost 30 years ago now, which is hard for me to believe, we have moved towards this idea of providing the tools for farmers to manage risk, knowing that farmers are, for the most part, operating very advanced financial entities. They are more than capable of managing risk, provided that they are given the tools and provided that those tools are given support. And so we now see those in two primary ways, and that is our commodity programs, which is that nice light blue slice of the pie, and then also crop insurance, which is now proportionally and in terms of dollar value, both the largest and most meaningful way that the government supports farmers. And so we have these two big chunks of the pie, and then we have, of course, the less than 1%. And that is all of these other, not to diminish their importance, but relative to the other farm-specific titles and farm-specific programs, all of these crucial aspects of a farmer's life and of agricultural production are bunched into this less than 1%. And so when we think about how the proportion of Farm Bill spending that goes towards these programs, it's minuscule. And then when we think about the proportion of total government spending that goes to these programs, it's even smaller than that. And it's really like a grain of sand on the beach almost in terms of how much it's devoted towards these other really crucial and increasingly important features of agriculture and agricultural development in the country. And so those are things like rural development, energy, of course, since the 2018 Farm Bill has been very incredibly important. All the disruptions with trade that we saw through the last 5 years, all of those aspects come into what it turns out to be a sort of sliver of total Farm Bill spending. So in terms of the safety net, I think I'm imagining I have a pretty, I was checking the names as you entered, and I know I have a pretty educated audience, so I don't need to talk too much about the importance of the farm safety net and what it does. But from the government's perspective, its primary purpose is to provide risk protection and financial support. So the idea that farm income is very volatile over time because farmers face a lot of what we call idiosyncratic shocks. So shocks that cannot be controlled for or predicted, like weather events, pests, diseases. Obviously, you can do things to mitigate them, but there's no way to reduce that risk to zero. That creates a lot of cyclicality in farm income. And then, of course, without even thinking about the volatility in the markets, farmers are exposed to increased risk. And so risk protection, of course, is the fundamental component of the farm safety net. There is also this idea of financial support. So we also want to, as much as we want to smooth income over time, we also want to make sure that the level of income over time is sustainable and livable, long into the future. And so from the government's perspective, there's three components. And those, of course, are two that we can, and if we divide them into the known in advance, or as I've liked to say, or as I've heard said, the known-ish, sort of known. Sometimes you can't predict it, sometimes you can. The known and the unknown. So typically we know our crop insurance. An individual farmer, of course, elects into different coverage level, different component of that. So it has some ability to predict what sort of protection is going to happen there. And then, of course, our primary farm commodity programs include things like ARC and PLC. Those, on the other hand, we've got our unknown or our ad hoc style farm supports. And these of course, are getting a lot of attention given the rate at which they were dispersed throughout the last 5 years since the last Farm Bill. And so these can occur through policies authorized by Congress or executive branch or USDA action using those. If you look back at our allocations from the Farm Bill, there's a small sliver for CCC. That's another way in which the executive branch or the sort of bureaucracy of the government can disperse funds to farmers in extreme situations or periods of high disruption like what we saw in the last 5 years. So this known-ish safety net, when we project them out, and if we look at the projections that were made for the current, that were made in 2018 for the current years, we see that these two components, so we have the commodity programs and crop insurance, initially they're about equal. And then of course, crop insurance, as we focus more and more on risk management, we focus on the idea of, sophisticated financial entities, sophisticated financial decisions being made. We see crop insurance taking primacy there, but roughly, if you squint, these are about equal. And then of course, the ad hoc payments are those that cannot be predicted. So this was the picture, the projected picture in 2014, looking ahead to the next two Farm Bills in terms of what was being provided as a known entity in the farm safety net. Of course, I know we've all heard these unprecedented times and we're sort of sick and tired of that, but it's a nice trope now to trot out at times like this. And that is when we think about how the farm safety net functioned during these unprecedented COVID times and also dealing with the trade war, we saw that the farm safety net were sort of, maybe not even sort of, but incredibly unpredictable. We had disruptions that could not be anticipated. So we had we got to observe how the farm safety net functioned in sort of extreme duress. And by and large, we would say that it worked well, but it worked well also because of these large amounts of ad hoc payments that were, required to be dispersed in response to these disruptions. And so if we look at the payments and net farm income for both the country overall and in Ohio itself, we see that, of course, the years of the pandemic and the trade war, so 2019, 2020, we had 2 years there where the farm safety net, sorry, I keep tapping the wrong button there. The farm safety net was really, really bolstered by these direct government payments and in a way that was financially and also proportionally very meaningful. And so this, I think, is going to be a fundamental feature that informs ongoing Farm Bill discussions. I think that there's an idea there's going to be debate around the idea of whether or not these ad hoc payments should have had to happen, or whether or not there should be supports to protect against things like this that are already baked into the Farm Bill, that are part of the baseline projections, that are part of those sort of entitlements, that to prevent these sort of unpredictability of this gray component of net farm income. And so that question of whether or not it works well to have ad hoc payments in a sort of idiosyncratic way versus the idea that these shouldn't have had to happen and that the farm safety net should have been there to protect operators, I think is going to be something that, and has already started to inform the conversations around the Farm Bill moving forward. I think that is going to be probably that, and then also the sort of political environment we find ourselves in, I think, which of course I can address in just a little bit. I think those are going to be the two things that sort of underpin this entire conversation around the Farm Bill. And so if we dive in a little bit more and look at the trends in farm income, we see that the disbursements of ad hoc funding that happened in 2020 and 2019, percentage-wise, were certainly not unprecedented. And so even though these years were the unprecedented times, there were other years, the early part of this century, the early years of the 2000s, where proportionally, at least in Ohio, but also nationally as well, to a lesser extent, where farm direct government payments made up around 50% of net farm income. And so this idea that what happened in 2020 was, completely new is a bit of an overstatement. 2021 is a bit of a unique case because there we saw, as you can see on this graph, we saw very high net farm income, but also high direct government payments. That's somewhat of a function of accounting. We saw payments for the crises that had happened earlier continuing to be put out in this year, which maybe pushed this a little higher than if we want to think about this safety net only being there and when it's needed, maybe pushed it higher than we would expect. But overall, we see that the farm safety net, if we were to trace out the trends in net farm income with or without direct government payments, farm income is still incredibly volatile and does experience a good deal of cyclicality. And so in terms of how the safety net is functioning, in terms of reducing volatility of farm income, we would say that it's maybe not keeping this as level as we would like to be year after year. Obviously, we like the years where it's farm income is higher than average, but then we also have to see years, that are dramatically lower, such as, of course, we have 2016, where net farm income was actually negative. And so in terms of direct government payments reducing volatility, not performing as well as it could be. And so speaking towards the functioning of the farm safety net, room for improvement there. But in terms of increasing the level or, maintaining financial stability, doing a relatively good job in that sense. And so we see this trend play out both nationally and in Ohio. Obviously, the extremes are going to be a little bit more extreme at a state level, where we don't have, the heterogeneity of weather across the country. Places, there's always someone who's doing good when you're not. And so we see that play out when we look at the national trends, but there the trends are much the same. We see still a good deal of cyclicality in terms of farm income, with our government payments, of course, receiving a lot of attention due to the number. Just like if we think about that increase in SNAP funding, the number there is very large and so is very salient, but the proportion is actually, when we think about it as a sum of its parts or percentage it is out of its whole, we see that it's not actually that unprecedented or not actually that great in magnitude. And so the farm safety net continues to be incredibly important and of course will be maintained in some way, and that is of course where the debate comes in, is what components make up an ideal safety net, and what form should that safety net take. And so I think that there is, I'd say, widespread bipartisan agreement that the safety net should exist, which if that's the degree of agreement we have, I think we might be in for a sort of rocky road in terms of negotiations. But at least we all have some objective in terms of a safety net existing in mind. And so when we look at projections for the safety net in the current Farm Bill allocations, so this is going to be a little bit misleading in that it also has the conservation titles in the graph. So I want us to focus on the light blue, which is our PLC program. And as we can see, as I said, it's really not kicking in until around 2026, 2027 in any meaningful way. And that is because those are the years where we're predicting significantly lower commodity prices. And so we're expecting there to be a higher need for these programs to kick in, which of course cover in the event of low price, for lack, just for simplicity's sake. We're seeing relatively stable projections for crop insurance, but what really is pushing the allocations or the projected outlays higher in these middle, the next 10 years, is these increases in ARC and PLC. And so on average, the increase or the amount of the farm safety net is going to range between $10 and $20 billion a year, going up in the years where we're forecasting lower prices. And of course, coming back down when those prices are more stable and higher. We know that so this red bar is that sort of unique situation with the IRA funding. That, of course, is due to expire and cannot be used after 2031. And so we see that disappear from the outlays as well. Of course, this remains an open question, how this money will actually be spent and where it will be incorporated into Farm Bill funding. I think that that's going to be a sort of very politically salient conversation, and it's really going to have, I think it's going to be a touch point, a hot point for both parties to debate how that funding should be allocated and in which, whether or not it's incorporated into the Farm Bill long term. And one last thing on the price loss coverage, reference prices. I have a slide on that later on, but I will just preview that a little bit. The question of whether or not reference prices that trigger price loss coverage payments or ARC payments as well, both of those, that is going to be another one of those sort of hot button touch point issues. Senator Bozeman, the ranking member of the Senate Ag Committee, has been very explicit in his support for, and in fact considers it a non-starter, that those prices be revisited. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit as well. Quick glance at my watch. In terms of the breakdown by commodity, I'm not going to spend too much time here. And really the most important thing to note are these little plus signs, which indicate an increase in the allocation for these specific commodities from that February 2023 baseline. And so if you feel like you see a plus sign pretty much everywhere, that is indeed accurate. Every commodity except for peanuts received increased allocations. And so in terms of what this means for Ohio, if we look at Ohio's cash receipts by commodity, it's not a perfect one-to-one mapping, because this is, of course, livestock disaster payments and livestock cash receipts. It's just a way to give a sense of where the majority of Ohio's commodity value is stored. And of course, we see, not surprisingly, our two major row crop commodities, corn and soybeans, also feature very heavily, very prominently in terms of Farm Bill allocation. Ohio is somewhat unique in that it has the strong grain sector, and then also a strong dairy sector as well. The stronger dairy states, we don't often also see them paired with a strong row crop commodity groups as well. And so the only other thing to note here is that, of course, there are a bunch of titles, a bunch of commodities that Ohio does not produce that are being covered. And then there is also, if we look at beyond these sort of traditional covered commodities, in Ohio, there's around 850 million in cash receipts from our vegetables, our specialty crops, floriculture, and things of that nature. That, specialty crops, if we go back to that, remember that allocation, what it looked like, horticulture and specialty crops have a very, very narrow slice of the pie. And so in terms of where their seat at the table is, they're just, I think, for lack of a better word, looking for any seat they can possibly get, and anything that any sort of concession they get feels like a win when you look at how these funds are allocated. And so when we look at Ohio's cash receipts breakdown, this, of course, only is including those that are reflected in these commodity baseline allocations. So it's not including everything in Ohio, and it does, miss a significant representation, more than wheat, and of course more than, this is the other, which in Ohio is just oats, significantly more than both of those that aren't being represented here. Conservation is another crucial part of the Farm Bill, and of course, always an area for spirited conversation. I'll say these projections are the February 2023. I couldn't find a really as nice of a breakdown program-wise from the May ones, and because the allocation for conservation didn't change very significantly between February 2023 and May, I just decided to run with this one, courtesy of our friends at FarmDoc. The big story here is really that this is that is shown right here is as I've mentioned, these IRA. A lot of that had been designated for equip, which you can see here in this purple. So this program is, as you may know, incredibly oversubscribed. So there's, I think the last projections I saw, or last estimates I saw, were there's 3 times the demand for the program than there are funds available. So a lot of this IRA funding, I think, had been earmarked for that. But of course, as I said, this is going to be an area where there's going to be a lot of, I think, spirited conversation. And so, as I've said, will these funds be absorbed? How they will be allocated when it all shakes out? Is this a place where we can make concessions on each side and move forward? Remains to be seen. But as I sort of highlighted in my initial outline, I think that these questions of conservation and sustainability, however you want to phrase it, they're not going away, and they're receiving increased focus sort of across the board. So government-wise, corporation-wise, it's really across the board. I think the language is going to differ, and that's where we start to see disagreement. But I think the objective is, I think, more or less in line with pretty much across all of these different stakeholders. And so I'm going to try and to the best of my ability be optimistic that this isn't going to be what sinks it. Which leads me to my next, the biggest question we have, and that is, will there be a 2023 Farm Bill? So if we pull up the scales and weigh both sides, we have some really significant factors on the no side, and that is, I hate to trot this out again, but that is these idea of unprecedented times. So not only in terms of the disruptions that were experienced, which led to these huge ad hoc payments and all of that, which were very salient for a lot of people, even outside of agriculture, and who started to pay maybe a little bit more attention to what farm support is like. So anytime that there's a situation like that, there's always going to be sort of, for lack of a better word, emotions get involved, and reality starts to get distorted. And so that alone, I think, would cause a lot of disruption to Farm Bill negotiations. In addition, we're seeing, by any measure you use, increased and much more significant partisanship. So if the Farm Bill has always been this sort of fundamental, piece of bipartisan, legislature, that the idea of these rural-urban coalitions, that sort of initial or early view of the Farm Bill as something that brought people together across parties, by commodity group or by region, we're going to really be putting that to the test in this day and age. The level of debate and political animosity across the aisle is quite high. And so in terms of years where we've had a Farm Bill, I think that this is going to be something that's incredibly significant. And we have extreme pockets on each side of the aisle as well, as we've gotten to see that sort of play out already with the debt ceiling, threatening to derail the sort of more middle of the road compromise, for however you want to phrase it. And so it's likely going to be something that is going to matter quite a bit for the Farm Bill as well, whether or not you can move these fringe groups more towards, some sort of weigh the scales, so to speak, if we move along with my little analogy here. We know that budget-related issues have caused delays before. We know that those budget-related issues often focus on the amount of funding allocated towards SNAP, and the different requirements around eligibility for that program. That, of course, hit us in both the last 2 Farm Bills that we've experienced, and of course, has also started to feature in the current Farm Bill negotiations as well, or sorry, the current debt ceiling negotiations as well. So if those don't sink it, they certainly will delay it. And we also often have seen this idea of these last minute, Hail Mary style deals, and it seems like nothing is coming easy. And so if these factors tip the scale towards no, and we don't have a farm bill in 2023, or we don't have something passed before expiration, this is what I'm calling the catastrophic risk, to borrow some crop insurance language, and that is that we revert to the 1949 Farm Bill, which I don't think is an outcome any of us, consumers, producers, policymakers, I don't think anyone wants to see that. And so if I was to put anything in the yes basket, it would be that, the idea that, we've come close before, but I don't know that any, serious policymaker, anyone who's seriously interested in agricultural issues and supporting American consumers and producers of food, I don't think that anyone wants to be the first people to not pass a farm bill. So and that is maybe it's Pollyanna-ish, maybe it's my optimism at work, but I'd like to think that this idea that we've always been able to do it, and so we will continue to. I think that that's going to be what comes out in the end. So far, because the conversation has stayed within the committees so far, I think that there's not really been anyone advocating a complete non-starter. I don't think anyone's come up with something that's going to completely push the other side, from the moderate wings all the way to the extreme. I don't think there's going to be anything that has been proposed yet that will be a complete deal sinker, and that is something that I'm holding on to as well. And at least, especially when you consider the Senate Ag Committee, the ranking member, Senator Boozman, and the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee, they have a long history of working together and working together somewhat productively. So both Senator Boozman and Senator Stabenow have a long history of cooperation, and so if we think about the personalities involved, I think that those are two relatively, everything is relative, of course, relatively stable ones who will move this forward. If will there be is an important question. When there will be is maybe an easier one to answer. It's no surprise. I think this barely qualifies as an educated guess. There's going to be delays. The idea of, I wrote ambitious on the slide, but I think I would say pipe dream probably. I think that there's a very, very low likelihood that anything happens, especially with the way I haven't checked the current state of the debt ceiling negotiations today. I know the vote is today, but I have busy polishing up these slides, so I haven't checked. But assuming, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, September 23 is, I think, a non-starter at this point. And so that pushes us likely into 2024 in terms of just thinking about the timeline. And so to end this this aspect of the talk, and I'm glancing at my watch, and I'd like to, I see some questions in the chat. I might push through my big picture policy stuff as well, but we'll wrap up the Farm Bill outlook here, and the big picture question that both sides are going to ask is, what does farm support look like? What is farm support? And I think that the idea, again, as I said, the idea that farms need to be supported is a universal one across both sides of the aisle, but then in terms of what that support looks like is where it all shakes out. As I mentioned, Senator Boozman has been very vocal on increasing those reference prices for PLC. That I think I'm not misquoting him here when I say that this is something that he said is a non-starter. He won't consider a farm bill without it. And so that, I think, will be maybe one of the first places where this conversation needs to happen. If some researchers at Texas A&M have done some relatively quick cost estimates for what an across-the-board price increase would look like, a 10% increase in reference prices would cost about $20 billion. And so when we go back and look at what the allocation is for these commodity Title I programs, $20 billion would be a significant chunk of that. So whether or not this shakes out remains to be seen. There's I think significant momentum are behind this. The reference prices have not been triggered in quite some time. They're certainly not going to be triggered this year as well. And so the idea there is that not only have they not really been relevant in a while, they also, there's an important time component to this as well, and that is that if these increases don't happen in this Farm Bill cycle, when we move to, if by the time the next Farm Bill cycle comes around, these prices will be, nearly 20 years out of date. And I think that's something that Senator Bozeman in particular and his staff and his constituents and colleagues have been pointing to as a reason to really revisit these now. One area that has also been receiving a lot of attention, a lot of buzz, is the market access programs. So some groups have pushed for even a doubling of these programs. And this, I think, maybe even more so than increasing reference prices, is a place where I see strong support across the aisle in sort of both directions. So in terms, now if we sort of switch gears and move a little bit beyond the Farm Bill and think about greater trends in agricultural policy, and I'm gonna breeze through this pretty quickly just because I'd like to leave the last 10 minutes for that discussion / Q&A. So I'll move really quickly. And so the first trend is this idea of the expansion of the farm safety net. And this is partly driven by changing things through the traditional means of the Farm Bill with its coalition building and its negotiation. It's not easy. And it's not easy because once there's a baseline allocation, once those projections are made, going over budget is not really in the cards. And so this makes any sort of Farm Bill negotiation a zero-sum game. A win for one program is a loss for another, a win for one commodity is a loss for another, and so on and so forth. And I think that in itself is driving this sort of movement away from the Farm Bill as being a fundamental part of, the Farm Bill will always be a fundamental part of agricultural policy, but its importance is sort of being eroded by these outside or sort of extra legislative actions. And so we're seeing expansion, as I mentioned at the start, both in terms of the breadth of support, so in terms of what's being covered, what's being protected against commodity-wise, and also risk-wise. I think that is expanding, and we're also seeing greater depth of support. And so we would think of those PLC reference price increases as another example of that, sort of increasing the depth or increasing the level of protection in the ways that have always been protected. We're also seeing it in those traditional, like if we remember that safety net versus 1%, we're seeing expansion or measures that could be considered safety net expansion in both the traditional safety net and also in the 1%. So when we think about energy protection against energy crises is its own form of safety net. And so we're seeing more attention in these sort of 1% program fundings being given to the idea of supporting agricultural producers and supporting them against various kinds of uncertainty and risk. We also see, the traditional measures of crop insurance, or sorry, the traditional measures of the farm safety net, those are increasing as well. Crop insurance spending going up. And then as I mentioned earlier, but I'd like to make the point again, the idea that these ad hoc payments that happened in 2020 were really sort of completely off the wall is not necessarily true when you look at them as a proportion of total government support. And so this sort of tealish line tracks direct payments as a proportion of net farm income, and we can see that there have been other times, times of significant financial agricultural crises where these direct payments have been very high. And so really what was notable in 2020 and 2021 was the level of ad hoc payments. So the amount was very sizable, but the proportion, again, was relatively reasonable and had occurred in the past. And so in terms of the safety net, the traditional Title I programs are probably always going to be there and not likely to change. But where we're going to start to see increased expansion is through this idea of broadening the availability of crop insurance, maybe to different kinds of producers. And then, of course, once you start tying in different, increased premium subsidies for different practices, it's really, I think, crop insurance is going to continue to receive increased focus and continue to be the area that receives the most policy updates. And then, of course, those ad hoc payments, the big debate will be whether or not they should be somehow incorporated in and made to be part of the predictable part of the Farm Bill, or whether or not they should continue to be ad hoc. Just in the interest of time, I think that this is something that we are all aware of, and we're seeing this sustainability more and more in the mainstream, and it's likely going to appear in the Farm Bill in a couple different ways. I know Senator Brown has already pushed for the cover crop, which are a part of sustainability, has pushed for those premium subsidies to be enshrined in the Farm Bill going forward. That's just one small way, but again, the idea here is that there's room for coalition building, and it's already occurred. So when we look at who alliances or agreements, the groups that these sorts of groups bring together, I think it's somewhat, again, giving me room for optimism. There are concerns, of course, that are valid on both sides, but the reality, particularly in the western part of the country, but in Ohio as well, we're seeing increased incident of drought. We also have some water scarcity issues, maybe more in the western states, but that could move east very, very quickly. Those are all reality. And so I think the disagreements occur around language and approach, but if we think about sustainability as using our resources so that future generations can also use them, if we think about who's going to be running our farms in the future, we want to make sure that they have the opportunities to also be as productive as we are. And so I think that idea is something that resonates across the board. And then, of course, the AI stuff, the technology, that's the old objective of agriculture that we've sort of been seeing throughout our history, is that we're producing more with less, or not even the same with less, but more with less. And so we've seen that be true, and it hasn't really slowed down. So we look at total agricultural output increases as inputs stay the same. What seems to be, and of course, if you know me or my work, that this is something that I can't get away from. What seems to be the moves now in terms of the technology being adopted on farms and this artificial intelligence is to make production less reliant on labor. So labor is certainly a pinch point, one that maybe isn't being incorporated into the Farm Bill, but I think future ag policy is definitely going to have to address the availability of technology and the kinds of technology, and ensuring that it's safe and it's productive. So in the last Farm Bill, we saw these land reducing innovations. So we think about confined space agriculture production, or indoor agriculture, or whatever you'd like to call it. We saw that get some attention in the last Farm Bill. And so this isn't unprecedented, this idea of, supporting innovations around input reduction. There, the input was land. Whether or not that could be other inputs in the future remains to be seen, and I'm hopeful that it does. Just quick conclusions. We share a lot of problems, and the Farm Bill is a process of coalition building for a reason. But of course, these policy issues are sort of going beyond the Farm Bill now and sort of bleeding into all other areas of the government bureaucracy. And then depending on how today goes and how the next couple weeks go, this may have all been rendered moot by how those negotiations work. So with that, I will stop talking. I apologize for running a little bit over. Happy to have a conversation now. I don't know if I should run the Q&A, or Ian, if you want to pull stuff from the chat.
Yeah, so thanks. Excuse me. Thanks very much, Margaret. You've spent a lot of time thinking about the Farm Bill, and it certainly showed in your presentation today. And I personally appreciated the later discussion We have a question in questions from Thomas O'Donnell. This came pretty early in the presentation.
Oh.
I understand that the value of farm food loss is in tens of billions of dollars each year. So this is about food waste. How about resolving this for many purposes, such as farm income and nutrition assistance, with a new food chain from farms to underserved communities? Lots of regular dollars are being lost. So that's kind of a big question.
I wish my colleague Brian was on.
Yeah, Brian's not here, sadly.
No, I mean, you make a point. Your figure is correct. Food waste, food loss, at different levels of the value chain. You know, whether that's at supermarkets, most of it does occur in the home. Just, you know, you buy something with, you know, like, I'm gonna make a salad tonight, and then the frozen pizza calls you. Never something that's happened to me. That's not a real example, of course, but a lot of it does occur post consumption, and so I think there's an important. You raise a really good point. I don't know that there's really been any conversation about that. Nothing that I've seen has made me think that that's something that's currently being discussed in the Farm Bill. That's not to say that it won't come up, but you raise a really interesting and important point about, you know, where we could be seeing some savings, maybe in those SNAP dollars, if there's a way to reroute food that's going to go to waste, get it into people's hands faster. And a lot of that has to do with distribution as well, whether or not people have access to grocery stores in the first place, let alone access to grocery stores that are, you know, selling fresh produce that will go to waste. No, that's really interesting. I hadn't ever thought about that as a part of the Farm Bill. Thanks.
Just a quick update. I just looked at the New York Times. The leader of the House, McCarthy, is trying to cobble together a vote this afternoon. It seems like quite a few Republicans are planning to vote against the bill, so it may require the Democrats supporting the bill. So that's going to be interesting in light of what you've discussed and the uncertainties that you, I think, yeah, you're putting the emphasis on the word moot. I don't see, you know, I see a couple of very nice compliments in the questions. So you may be new to the Farm Bill, but I think people found what you had to say very valuable. I have a question. So this is what you might expect a trade economist to ask.
Oh no.
So in 2019, 2020, 2021, yeah, they were unusual years. Former chief economist at USDA, Joe Glauber, I remember at the time saying that it was pushing the United States awfully close, farm spending, to breaching our agreed aggregate measure of support under the Uruguay round agreement in the WTO. Is there any spending's come down since we're not we don't have those special payments that were being made to compensate farmers, for example, for the loss of market share in China during the trade war. But in your analysis of the Farm Bill, do you see any discussion of, or are we going to bump up against those boundaries? Again, I know that's a difficult question to answer, but I just thought I'd throw that one out there for you.
Whew, that is a difficult question to answer. I think in everything that I've come across so far, the concern is always much more inward focused. So I think the initial hurdles of putting together a Farm Bill that's digestible even to the members of our own government, it seems to be always of the utmost importance. And then the considerations of what the international reaction will be, or these intragovernmental organizations like the WTO, what their reaction will be always seems somewhat secondary. And so it's a question of, I think it's a second order concern. I think it obviously, and I think you would agree that it should have more of a front forward, have more primacy in these conversations. But everything I've seen, no one's really concerned about that at this point. I think that the majority of the buzz I've heard about our relationship with our international partners is around this idea of increasing market access to new markets. And so this idea that, you know, the trade deficit obviously got a lot of buzz during the last administration, and I think that that's still something that's very relevant and very much on the top of, at least on the Republican side, something that they'd really like to address. I'm sure you have your own opinion on whether or not that's an important metric, but there the issue is really more that the thing that's gotten more attention, I would say, at least initially now in the stage we're at this point, is around increasing market access to new markets. So like whether that's, you know, Southeast Asia, you know, something to replace our lost goodwill or lost trading relationship with China. So whether that's Africa or you know, the Middle East, I think that that's really where the trade deficit is more what they're focused on, rather than worrying about whether this will be received well internationally, or indeed, you know, send us to WTO negotiations.
I guess in answer to my own question,
yeah, go ahead.
you know, the WTO is kind of moribund at the moment, in the sense that we never reached an agreement in the Doha round, and also the appellate board of the WTO is not functioning. So even if other members of the WTO chose to target US farm spending as violating the aggregate measure of support, if there was a ruling against the United States, it would simply be appealed into oblivion by the United States. And I think the focus globally is really more on regional and free trade agreements. But sadly, the current administration is not currently negotiating any significant trade agreement. The purported one with the UK is not even happening right now, and I think there's a very small agreement with Kenya in East Africa.
Right. Since
we didn't sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we sort of backed away. I think there's actually bipartisan support actually for maintaining a relatively protectionist approach to China. So I only asked because I was just curious to see if it came up in the negotiations. Well, I don't see.
I'll keep an eye out for it, but yeah, so far, no.
I think I always ask the same question when we're having our farm bill discussions. So, if there are no more questions from the audience, again, I'd like to thank Margaret very much for, you know, stepping out a little bit out of her comfort zone to talk about the farm bill and get up to speed with where we are. And I think you did a great job of informing us of a lot of the details and the uncertainties. Just to summarize where we are, this is the last of our spring webinar series. So just a little bit of heads up advertising here. As we come towards September, we have the Farm Science Review, where the department has organized a panel, surprisingly, not surprisingly, on the Farm Bill. Hopefully we'll be a bit more up to date as to where things are going with that. But that I will be moderating that panel at the Farm Science Review on the first day, and Margaret again will be stepping up to the plate to present, along with our colleague Seung-Ki Lee, who, as you know, is a commodity markets expert, and then Brent Songen, who can probably talk in more detail about things like the Conservation Reserve Program and his views on where that's coming out in the Farm Bill. And then looking even a little bit further ahead into the future, our next really big activity with the department is our annual Outlook and Policy Conference on November the 13th at the 4-H Center. We've already sent out a save the date, but we'll be sending out invitations for that. And we're going to have a pretty packed program. We're going to have another panel on the Farm Bill that day with some different folks from the Ohio Farm Bureau. Jonathan Koppes has agreed to come over from the University of Illinois. As you know, he's a renowned expert on the Farm Bill. And we're hoping to get somebody from Marathon Oil who will sort of give us a view of the energy sector on biofuels, and particularly biodiesel. So we hope you're all going to be able to come out to the Farm Science Review, visit with us there, and hopefully we'll see many of you at our Outlook and Policy Conference in November. So thanks once again for attending today. Thank you to everybody who's maybe been to multiple of these webinars, and we really appreciate your attendance, your questions, and your support for what we do in outreach and extension in the department. So with that, I'd like to say goodbye on behalf of the department, Margaret in particular, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Have a good summer, everyone.
Nice job, Margaret.
Thanks, Jan.